Hello everyone. In this video I'm planning to explain how I work with validating and mutating webhooks and how admission controllers communicating with Kube API server and checking response inside of validating and mutating webhooks, because I'm planning to prepare a series of the Kyverno videos, and do that firstly we must understand, if we want to go in deep to Kyverno, of course, how it works, and when we write new policy and cluster policy rules inside of Kubernetes clusters, and to understand how kind admission review comes to the Kyverno and how we can validate or mutate each time request object inside of admission review and how we work with it. And do that, I wrote one validator and one mutating webhooks, which will communicate with the application which I wrote in Python. And the first point we must understand, it's admission controllers. It's some collection of the codes which we, after of course authorization and authentication with Kube API server, going to communicate with controllers, with webhooks. Sorry, it is mutator validating webhooks. Just imagine, when we are going to apply some kind, it doesn't matter which kind supports our application inside of Kubernetes cluster, which works with validating and mutating webhooks. It is going to get admission review from Kube API servers, where admission controllers do this stuff for us. Firstly, it's going to ask all validating or mutating webhooks inside of Kubernetes cluster and check if one of them will respond to object admission review, which prepared from Kube API server. It's going to validate or mutate the stuff. In case of validate, it's going to prepare it. If it is okay in admission response, it will give state. Of course, I will show you right now all the stuff which I prepared. I'm just trying to explain theory stuff. And in case of validated, in the response it will write it's allowed, or in case of fail it will write it's denied. In allowed, key value true or false, and with some message, of course. In case of mutate, it prepares admission response inside of admission review and include which part must be patched in the kind, in the object which tries to come inside of Kubernetes cluster. So let me switch from easy part, which I did. I created namespace kubhook, which inside of this namespace I created deployment, deployment which looks to my image, where we have two endpoints, /validate by default and /mutate, which hooks going to discuss with it. In case of when new admission review comes, it's going to post to /validate or /mutate admission review which comes, and we can parse this part and do what we want. It doesn't matter. And it was stuff of deployment. It is stuff of deployment which we will try apply. It's not important right now. I will close it. So I explained this part. It is service which is responsible for validating and mutating webhook. Actually it is service of the deployment which I showed before, and each time admission review comes to discuss with this service. This is mutating and validating webhook configuration itself, and I want to explain a little bit. As I said before, we have two endpoints, /mutate and /validate. So in both of them, in case of event, some kind, in our case, I've used kinds, pods and deployments, when they will be created or updated in place. If someone will edit to change something inside of pod or deployment, it works in this API group. In endpoint mutate will be happen mutation if it will not match our rule, or in case of validate, it will be validated, and if it's not matched, in the response we will write it's not allowed, and some response message to be clear And in case of mutate, so main point, how it works, I will explain inside of code tool. When pod or deployment will come to our cluster and label will not present, for example, I will open applied resources, label version will not present there, validate webhook will not give permission to be applied inside of Kubernetes cluster. In case of deployment too, but in case of the deployment, of course, it's under spec template metadata labels must be present to get it. And in case of mutation, it's going to check if environment variable will not present for each of them. It's going to mutate object on the fly to apply it to kind, pod or deployment, it doesn't matter. So it is a main part which I needed to explain to you. This is a bundle file which even I wrote it inside of README. Of course you can get it from GitHub. I will push it at the end of the video when everything will be done. So as we see, let me find a place where I'm going to prepare it. I'm going to get public key from key pair which I created here and encode it to base 64 right inside of the bundle of the validating and mutating webhook, because my web server which I wrote in Python, I'm going to explain this part too, of course, using this private key and cert, and validating and mutating webhook must be authorized to my service which I wrote. And I think I explained all important part validating and mutating webhooks itself. I can close it. This is Python code main file, which inside of Docker file we can see. At the end I'm going to execute main py, which calls of course functions inside of source functions. I will explain them too. So in case of when post request will come from when, of course, after authorizing, so I mean when you will apply pod or deployment, if user trying to, which user trying to apply these kinds already authorized and authenticated inside of Kubernetes, Kube API service on the fly will prepare admission review. Like as response, it will post the content of the request to mutate or validate endpoints. So we have two endpoints for that, validate and mutate. And in case of mutate endpoint function will call handle mutate from source functions, and in case of validate endpoint it's going to call handle validate. We can see here I'm using the certificate which I created before inside of README, of course you can find it, and I'm going to get functions to explain it. Handle mutate function going to get request object which comes from post, get it like as just shown, and here I'm going to check. In case of pod or deployment, catch, of course, I just wrote it like as test purpose to explain how it works. We can improve this part because inside of deployment I'm going to get container with the zero index, but it doesn't matter right now. We can improve it. The main point to understand how it works. And here I'm going to check if environment inside of container will be present. I'm going to check the key and value present there. If not, of course, I'm going to add it. And it is main part which, as we see, it is mutate function. And in case of mutate, if environment key will not present there, on the fly we are going to create patch key, which will include operation add, which we use inside of admission review. Like as admission response, we can see we prepare it on the fly here. It needed to be converted to base 64 to be inside of part admission response. And patch says I'm going to get pass and value from settings. We can see I defined it inside of variables. So what does it mean? This part must be present inside of env. If env key will not present, we will add it. If env key will not present, we will create env add it. And if not, I mean if env key is not, if it's present, we will check. If this key and value present there, it's good. If not, we will add it, of course. So I'm going to back to the function. Here I'm creating like its admission response itself. It's going to be included inside of admission review, which comes from Kube API server. And at the end, I'm going to return with JSONify to back where request came, actually to the API service. I mean, API service, Kube API server will see response which part of the kind must be patched, and then it's going to apply it to inside of pod or deployment, it doesn't matter. The same thing for handle validate, it's validating. So I'm going to check inside of pod or inside of deployment. I'm going to check if a version label will present there or not. So as we see inside of admission response, I'm creating, in case of course, version will be present there. If not present there, I'm going to return back allowed false, and with this message, string message comes from variables, we can get it from you actually. And in case of it is present there, inside of admission response will be allowed true, and we give permission inside of admission response. We inform Kube API service, please apply this because it's good, and as a return we give full object of admission review back to the Kube API service. So right now image is created, deployed to the Kubernetes cluster. Even from logs we can see it's log output of this image deployment, which works right now. Both of endpoints works there. And if I'm trying to apply pod without version inside of pod or inside of deployment, it must to inform us from service, which works inside of kubhook namespace with the name WebHook service. So I'm going to apply it. As we see, it informs us the label with the version is not present inside of pod. The same thing for deployment. It's not present. If I will change back for pod and deployment, both of them will be created. And we must to check. As we see, it's not included environment variables here. We cannot find it here. It's the same for pod 2. So on the fly, mutating must insert environment variable from variables which would defined here. With env key environment with value production must be present for both of them. I mean pod and deployments too. So get pods. As we see, it is already added. In case of deployment, so as we see, it's added to deployment too. So actually that's it. I hope it will be useful to all of us.